Hello, my name is Katie Eves and I'll be presenting information on a study that I recently conducted as part of my integrated project alongside my supervisor Jackie Gatland, who is a PhD candidate at Southern Cross University. The project was carried out on a sugarcane production farm on acid sulphate soils near Tumbulgum on the New South Wales far north coast along the Tweed River. This study aimed to explore the levels of carbon dioxide and methane gases in water collected from the artificial drains and also the creeks around the property, and to assess whether the drains act as sources or sinks for these greenhouse gases. The study site is on a private property at Stotts Creek near Tumbulgum, New South Wales, which is approximately 600 metres south of the Tweed River at the closest point. The land at this site is heavily modified for sugarcane production and is extensively drained by artificial drains that are positioned around the property, and then the water is pumped into adjacent creeks which flow into the Tweed River. The creek to the eastern side of the property is McLeod's Creek, and on the western side is Leday's Creek. The Tweed River is tide dominated and salt water can intrude up to 25 kilometres from the river mouth during the dry season, but the wet season at this location is summer dominant, which is November through March. And as the site is less than 0.4 of a metre below mean sea level, tidal waters are allowed to flow into the main drainage channel via a modified floodgate, and the water level is controlled by an automated pump, which allows for tidal flushing but prevents inundation. Acid sulphate soils occur across the whole study site, as shown in the bright pink shading in this map from the Tweed Shire Council. The consequences of modifying or disturbing land on acid sulphate soils can be extensive if not thoughtfully approached and managed. Artificial drainage systems have the potential to carry harsh, acidic and metal-enriched waters into creeks and rivers, and they can also produce greenhouse gases such as methane and nitrous oxide, and influence carbon dioxide exchange and sequestration. The water samples we took were taken in the field over 2 days during a long dry period. We measured water quality parameters, CO2 and CH4. Most of the drains were fairly dry with only small amounts of water in most of the smaller drains. Water was collected at 14 sites on the property, 9 of which were drains and 5 were samples from the 2 creeks running either side, which are shown there in orange. Samples were also collected in 200ml bottles to later add headspace and analysed in the lab just as a backup method, but they weren't needed any further. The original plan was also to measure radon in drain and creek water to trace groundwater, but however, due to equipment failure, this wasn't possible. In the field, we took the Picaro G2202i analyzer to measure gas concentrations on the fly for efficiency and accuracy. The Picaro was also used in the lab to analyse the backup samples after headspace was added and samples were refrigerated. Water quality between sites varied quite greatly. Temperatures ranged from 10.5 to 21.2 degrees, some of which were sampled in the early morning, and pH varied between 4.3 and 7.2, with the lowest pH occurring in the drain closest to the automated pump. Salinity ranged from 20.9 to 29.1 parts per thousand, and the highest level occurred in the main drains that were connected to Leday's Creek. Dissolved oxygen ranged between 65 and 188.2% saturation, and the highest record occurred in a main drain connecting to that same creek. The findings from our study suggest that both drains and creeks at the study site are enriched with carbon dioxide and methane. Global atmospheric levels of CO2 have recently reached 400 parts per million, but when we compare the measurements found at this study with the global levels, it's clear that the study site is a source for CO2 uptake in the atmosphere. All sites sampled are enriched and well above the global atmospheric level of CO2, and the red line on this graph indicates 400 parts per million, and we recorded levels between 614 and 3,733 parts per million, which is almost 10 times the global atmospheric level. The water bodies at this particular site also have elevated levels of methane. This graph, as the previous one, shows the global atmospheric level of methane sitting at 1.8 parts per million, and data from our study showed samples range between 2.2 and 13.8 parts per million, keeping in mind that methane is a greenhouse gas with a global warming potential of 20 times that of CO2 over a 100-year period. So even though the data looks quite a lot less than carbon dioxide, its warming potential is quite a lot higher. So what's the driver between these elevated levels of greenhouse gases? There's many factors controlling carbon dioxide and methane fluxes in both freshwater and saltwater. Environmental factors such as temperature, salinity, dissolved oxygen, photosynthesis, and groundwater inputs can be influential on the concentrations of CO2 and CH4 present in water systems, both natural and artificial. The fact that the sugarcane farm is on acid sulfate soils may suggest that soil processes are having an influence on drainage surface waters and possibly leaching into groundwater. So it's most likely that all of these factors are contributing to the state of the water drained from the sugarcane farm and eventually pumped out into the river. Now, the aim of this study originally was to trace groundwater and determine if there was a relationship between areas of high groundwater input and concentrations of CO2 and CH4, and thus suggesting a source for uptake. However, during the field study, the equipment for tracing radon failed, and we didn't have any access to further gear able to trace radon in the field. However, it's still possible to make assumptions on whether the groundwater may be a driver of CO2 enrichment in this case, as partial pressures of carbon dioxide in groundwater is typically 10 to 100 times more than the atmosphere, as was evident in our data. So if groundwater is the driver at this particular study site, artificial drainage and heavy modification of the land could be a cause and possibly a source of degasification of greenhouse gases from the groundwater that otherwise may have been contained. Carbon dioxide in wetlands is controlled by a number of factors, including the decomposition of organic matter, temperature, the use of fertilizers, photosynthesis, and the respiration from plants. In this study, we found the highest levels of CO2 were in the deepest main drains, with some organic matter in each. When wetlands are left unmodified, they sometimes act as a carbon sink, whereas when drained, they tend to release more CO2 to the atmosphere and become a source. Determining the source of CH4 requires exploration of a range of factors that may collectively influence methane production. The factors at play include the level of the water table, temperature, plant life, substrate type, climate, methanogenic bacteria, and transport mechanisms. In this study, it was found that the sample sites with the highest measurements of methane were the ones directly adjacent to a current crop. And the sites with higher methane may be influenced by the nearby crops where organic matter and nutrients are more likely to occur in the water, and hence higher methane production from decomposition and photosynthesis. All sites recorded levels of CH4 that qualify as sources for methane uptake into the atmosphere. So the site in red, site 4, was the highest level of methane recorded, and those that followed were in orange, as you can see on this map. And the only parameter that suggested a relationship was dissolved oxygen when comparing it with methane levels. This graph gives a rough idea of the pattern of dissolved oxygen and CH4 followed over the course of the sampling. When comparing other parameters such as pH, salinity, and temperature with levels of carbon dioxide and methane, there wasn't any significant relationship between them. However, when comparing the time it took from sampling to actually running the sample through Picaro, the longest time period was also the highest recorded level of methane, which may suggest a relationship, but other sites didn't seem to follow trends, so it may have been purely coincidental. As groundwater was not able to be traced during the study, it's difficult to pinpoint the source of high CO2 and methane inputs. It's possible that groundwater is the source and being influenced by soil chemistry. However, more research is needed to make a definitive statement. Whatever the source of these gases is, it's definitely acting as a source for uptake by the atmosphere, and not a carbon sink as most wetlands usually are. The release of these gases is contributing to global warming on a small scale compared to other commercial operations, but when you think about how much sugarcane Australia produces on an annual basis, it may not seem so insignificant anymore. Detailed carbon budgets and hydrology models specific to individual sites would broaden the knowledge of the processes at play in drained wetlands, as it is largely unknown how these processes operate, and there's been little investigation in the past. The understanding of possible impacts and emissions is quite minute. To fully understand the effects of artificial drainage in acid sulfate soils wetlands, broad-based studies across many study sites and timescales should be implemented. The long-term effects of draining water from wetlands for agriculture can be environmentally catastrophic if not understood and managed properly. And if there are opportunities to restore drained wetlands that are no longer used for agriculture, it's possible to lessen some impacts and encourage processes that enhance carbon storage and sequestration in the soil profile. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you and see you later. Bye-bye.